All right. Now that we've seen how trade benefits two countries, and it allows them to access more goods than they could produce themselves. So now we will look at the effect of trade barriers or protectionism on the benefits that they could have received or realized. Protectionism means when the government policies restrict or restrain international trade. So why would the government want to restrict trade? The basic idea or classic argument would be to protect domestic industries and jobs from foreign competition, right? This is what we call protectionism. So if we let a lot of imports come into a country, that we will lose jobs in that particular industry, and also our domestic industry cannot compete with these cheap, imported product. Now, there are two policies that we would like to focus on. The first one is called tariff policy. The tariff means taxes that levied on imported goods and services. So we have two types of tax or tariff. The first one is called ad valorem. The ad valorem tax, this tax equal to the percentage of the value of the good. For example, if a watch, right, the imported price is say $100, ad valorem could be 5% of $100, which is the value of the good, right? So $5 is ad valorem tax imposed on that particular $100 worth of good. The second type of tariff is called specific tariff. This specific tariff is per unit tax. What is it? What is a per unit tax? The same watch, right? The watch of $100, it could be $2 per watch will be the import tariff for that. So $100 worth of watch could be paying $7 worth of the tariff because a watch could have both types of the tariff, the ad valorem and the specific tax. To think about very expensive watch like Patek Philippe, that is about $30,000 a watch, the 5% of $30,000 is quite big, and then they have the $2 per watt specific tax on that too. But for our very principal level, we are not going to deal with the ad valorem tax. We're just going to stick with just specific tax or per unit tax. The other policy is an import quota. Import quotas means a limit, right, set on the quantity of product that can be imported into a country at a specific time. Sometimes the quota for a year, right, it could be met within a couple of months, something like that. So it's a certain quantity that will be allowed for the import to come into a country. So there's some special case that instead of putting a restriction on the amount of cars imported from Japan, at some point in the past, Japan actually has what we call voluntary export restraints on the number of cars that would be exported to the United States. It's a similar way of, a similar result as an import quota anyway, but restricted by an exporting country. All right. So now what we are going to analyze next is two things. Who gains from these import quotas and import tariff, and who loses from these policies? Okay, who gains, who loses. So let's take a look at the tariff first. So hold on. Well, but again, I actually have a question that you can keep in mind. I already told you the definition of these two policies. Who do you think gain from this policy, and who do you think will lose from this policy? All right, keep in mind. All right, the number one, tariff policy. So let's start from the market equilibrium. When there is no international trade, right? When there is no international trade, we only have domestic supply and domestic demand. And with domestic supply and domestic demand, the domestic price is $140 at an equilibrium. Now, assume that market opens up. Okay, when market opens up, it means we allow as much imports as the consumer is willing to buy and willing to pay for. So the world price is a certain price lower than $140 for sure for this particular shoes, right? So the supply shifted to the right. This supply label free trade here is the total supplied in the United States. Now, since the supply has increased, right, the price falls from PD of 140 to PF or PW here of a world price at 100 or free trade at 100. So domestic production got to compete with the imported goods. So with the quantity supplied domestically will be only QD1. You see this? QD1. But at the price of 100, the quantity demanded will be QW. So the imports then equal to QW minus QD1, right? QW minus QD1. So this would be the amount of imports without a tariff, or the amount of import under the free trade. Okay? All right. So now we are going to impose specific tariff. Now the price is $100. And let's assume the specific tariff is $20 for a pair of shoes. One pair, $20. So it will bring the price up to $120. Okay? So bring the price up to $120, which is equivalent to restrict the amount of supply because they're not going to be the same amount of imports anymore. This amount of import, right, this total amount of import is from the free trade price of $100. Now the price is going to be $120. The supply with tariff is going to shift to the left a little bit compared to the supply free trade. And the total amount of quantity of import will be smaller, right? Because at the price of $120, right, a higher price, a domestic producer will respond by producing more from QD1 to QD2 at the price of $120. So domestic supplier produce QD2. Consumers see a higher price and consume fewer pairs of shoes at QT. So the amount of import with the tariff will be the difference between the QT and the QD2. So foreign producers sells less, right? Foreign producers sell less. Now, a lot of areas here you already understand before when we did consumer surplus, producer surplus. Okay, and I will review some of these when we meet together during the virtual meeting. Now, the total area here, the consumer is going to lose a lot of consumer surplus. So now let's take a look. There's a loss of consumer surplus. The loss of consumer surplus is going to be the whole area here. PS, A, T, and B, right? PS, A, T, and B. Those whole things are the loss in consumer surplus. Again, the consumer surplus, remind yourself, is an area underneath the demand curve, above the price line, right, up to the quantity consumed, right? Price was 100 before. Everything below the demand curve above this 100 will be consumer surplus. Now price raised to 120, so this area is a loss in consumer surplus. Okay, PS, A, T, B, those are the loss in consumer surplus. Now, domestic producer gained this area. That's why it labeled PS, because it was from a price of 100 to 120, right? So PS is the gain for the producers. Now, another portion here is the T. This area T is the government revenue, right? Transfer from the consumer surplus, right? Become the government tariff revenue. So how do we find this box? See, it's 20 units, $20 per unit on these many units, right? So it's a product of 20 times the difference between QT and QD2, right? Whatever this area is. This is the area for the tariff revenue. So area A and area B, these areas are the deadweight loss from this policy. This is the inefficiencies created by the tariff policy. Some consumers, right, are forced to switch from the foreign brand to the domestic brand, right? The consumer is still in the market. And some consumers are forced to not consume anything at all. The area B is the loss of the consumption benefit, right? So the inefficient domestic producers now get to enter the market, right? A lot of these people cannot compete with 100 when the price is a little higher. See, it's inefficient to produce at a higher cost than if we were just importing. All of this together, let me repeat it one more time. This whole area, the shaded area here, PSATB, those are the consumer surplus, loss in the consumer surplus. Some of these redistributed to the producer. Area PS is the positive change in the producer surplus. Area T is the positive change to the tariff revenue. Area B and A and B here will be the deadweight loss because nobody get it. All right, so on the next slide, what we just did, the tariff has the effect as you somehow moved your country far away from other nations, right? Increasing transportation costs would be the same idea as this, okay? So tariff and transportation costs can add to the total cost, right, of selling the product in the domestic market. So with the tariff, you isolate your nation from others around the globe on purpose, basically. So recap here is consumer lose since they pay more and buy less. Domestic producer gain since they can now sell more at a higher price. Foreign producers lose since the amount they sell falls. And there's a welfare loss since the total sales are down, right? The amount of the total unit of consume down. And this is inefficient because some of the producers will have a higher cost of production, will increase their production and enter the market. All right. So on the next slide, is there a loss that not seen in the graph on that slide that not slide number 38, whatever the slide number is, I did not change. Do we see any other losses? Definitely. Because foreign producers have less dollars, right? So they will not be able to buy as many U.S. exports. So it could be that we might get gains in the jobs in the protected industry, but a loss in the jobs in another industry, right? Fewer sales by U.S. exports, so that's a loss of job in that industry right there that we did not show on the graph, but there's an effect. So now we're going to look at the quotas. So the import quotas, this is very similar, okay? So here's the same thing as to start 140 with a world price of 100, consumer wanted to consume QW, and the domestic producer can only produce QD1. So suppose the government imposes a quota. So this is the amount of imports between QW minus QD1, too much. We want to restrict that to be smaller. So we're going to restrict it to be smaller. And here what happened. So the amount of import quota got imposed and said, you know what, we're not going to let you import as much. We're going to let you only this much. You can imagine that there is another line that going through this right here and make the price become 120. That will become the supply, domestic supply plus the quota. Okay, so that will be domestic supply plus the quota. So that will be equivalent to the tariff. Okay, now same idea. On top of this, when you look at the same area, PSAFB, PS will represent the gain to in domestic producer surplus, right? PS is the gain represent the gain in domestic producer surplus. Area A and B is the deadweight loss. But area F, here's the thing. For the area F, okay, this area represented the tariff revenue before to the government, but now it is a revenue that foreign producers can earn, right? Because if I get the quota to export to United States, then I can enjoy the price of 120 instead of exporting at 100. So 120, and that area F, instead of being a tariff revenue, now is the extra revenue for the foreign producers who are able to export to United States. So to the U.S., the deadweight loss to the U.S. is larger, Now it's A, F, and B, right? It used to be area F is again for the government. Now it's not. So for tariff and quotas, when you compare that, when it has the same amount of imports, the quota is actually worse, right? The deadweight loss is A, F, B instead of just A and B. Now, so we're going to take a look at total what happened. Very similar to tariff, except with a quota, there is no government tariff revenue. This is based on the assumption that the amount of imports is the same in both cases, tariff and quota. The foreign producers will voluntarily agree to restrict their exports because they can keep the area F, right? Why not? I'm going to restrict my export so that the price that I can receive from exporting to United States is higher than if I exported at the world price, right? So foreign producers actually liked it. They want to avoid a tariff, right? And they restrict their export to a country and then gain additional revenue since the price is now higher and have to pay tariff, right? All right. Is there another loss from this type of protection? Definitely. Goods that could have been produced using the resources that we force the inefficient producers to produce a little more at a higher price, those resources could have been used to produce something else. And there are some ongoing arguments, right? A few of them, which I'm going to just go through this and we get this chapter done. So there are many reasons, right, that they're trying to convince people that protectionism is great. What are those reasons? Reason number one, national security. United States should produce weapons, energy, transportation, etc., instead of relying on potential enemies. Don't import, just produce everything on our own. Well, maybe, but United States has used this defense even in cases where we impose tariff on our allies, right? So it doesn't really work, okay? Infant industry argument is another argument that people use, right? They said, okay, brand new domestic industries, they need some trade protection until they can compete with the international competitors. But here's the truth. Once tariffs are in place, they are difficult to remove. If they are protected, they're going to be protected forever. So how does the government decide which industries are likely to survive in the long run? Okay, so those are the two possible problems, right? Which one you think is going to survive in the long run, and once is there, protection is there, it's so hard to remove. Now, the third one, reason for trade barriers, they said this makes sense because we need to retaliate those countries that dump in our market. Okay, what is dumping? So in 2009, United States government imposed tariff about 35% on radial car tires, okay, imported from China. Why would they do that? They did that because they suspected that there's a dumping case, which means the sale of a good by Chinese supplier at the price below what it is sold for in China, right? If you sell in the United States lower than the price that you charge in China, you must be trying to dump in our market. So when the United States in 2009 imposed that 35% tariff on the tires, the imports fell from 13 million to 5 million, okay? So the average price of the unit's tires increased from around $31 to $38. So the average price of the US tires increased from around $54 to $62. So what does it mean in this case? It means, right, the Chinese company might use this strategy to penetrate the US market, okay? Or if the dumping subsidized, countries can impose countervailing duties to offset that. So if we think that the Chinese government subsidizing this tire company, then we should impose a tariff to counteract that. That's why it's called countervailing duties to offset that. Now, the next thing here I want to point here is protectionist policies are maintained even if the costs outweigh the benefits, doing and go after these dumping issues is really highly costly. But on top of that, when we impose the tariff, right, cost to consumers also very high because prices are higher. Okay, and we try to save job, meaning the cost per job saved, it actually is large than income earned by the person whose job is saved. Okay, so consumer would be better off without a tariff, definitely, and allowing the person to lose his job and then compensate whoever the lost job income, right? We could do that. Now, it could be the reasons to do trade barriers just to favor to special interests, meaning, very good friend with one company or one industry, so we should protect the industry, right? So now, what I'm trying to say here is that dumping could be for different reasons. It doesn't have to be that they're doing this to penetrate the market. All right, so now practice what you know. Number 6, one result of a tariff on imported good, is it to increase trade on the good, increase economic efficiency, lower prices for the imported goods, or would create deadweight loss? Right, it would create the deadweight loss. Okay, so when the price of good goes up, right, using the government acquire revenue, but there's also some consumer surplus transfer to nobody, right? So that's the deadweight loss. So this deadweight loss is the result of decreased transaction or the amount of goods consumed that would have otherwise occurred. All right, next question. Why is dumping often seen as unfair? People don't like imports. Consumers don't like when the price fall. It's often the result of foreign government subsidies rather than legitimate comparative advantage. It allows domestic and foreign firms to collude and raise price of the good. Yes, C. Unfair because it could be the result of subsidizing. So it is often the result of foreign government subsidize the company or the industry rather than comparative advantage. So when the foreign government subsidize the production of any good, that foreign firm has an advantage, right? Dumping cheap subsidized goods will help gain entry into another country, another market. So domestic producers who don't get the government help cannot compete with the low prices. All right, and that's the end of chapter 19, and you can take a look at the conclusion on your own. All right, so we're done with this 19. Hope to see you in the virtual meeting and then go over a few examples together.